Start prepping your drones, Lieutenant. Here's my personal contact. Send me coordinates. I'll have the ships delivered wherever you need them. I want in on this too. Can't let him have all the toys, he added, nodding toward Wolf. And, let's not forget, training a starfighter pilot isn't a 3-day task. We're constantly short on them in the fleet. The outcome of the trials created an unprecedented situation for the Earth Federation. For the first time, the Ministry of Defense placed a direct contract with a private company to develop several types of new weaponry. Normally, such work was handled by state-run research institutes and universities. Private firms did conduct R&D, of course, but always at their own expense, and they submitted only finished prototypes to the ministry for testing. This time, however, there were no ready-made models to present, unless one counted the upgraded trophy units we'd salvaged from Roy's forces, which hardly qualified. So, the ministry placed an official order with us for the ground forces, a system of unmanned drones controlled by a command-type combat robot. For the fleet, drone fighters designed to operate as wingmen for piloted lead ships. And on top of that, I managed to convince Barrington to fund the development of boarding drones and their deployment platforms. The general was skeptical, but Admiral Nelson backed me, and a vice admiral on the review board also expressed interest in the concept. It was a rare moment when we had everything: funding, resources, and the right people. We worked like plantation slaves, but, oddly enough, we enjoyed it that I'd often drag myself to academy classes barely alive, and it took me a while to notice that the instructors never called me out when I showed up in that state. Whether they understood what I was going through or had been given specific instructions from higher up, I couldn't say. I didn't like the special treatment, but I accepted it as a fact of life, doing my best not to fail the regular assessments. I usually succeeded. Major Lyndon vanished from our group without a trace. The second major disappeared as well. Only the captain remained, quiet now, though he still occasionally cast cautious but venomous glances in my direction. It took us 2.5 months to prepare the new systems for their first round of testing. As soon as we were ready, I pinged Admiral Nelson on his communicator. Admiral, I'm ready to bring the hardware to your fleet's location. What exactly are you planning to bring, Lieutenant? 9 unmanned fighter drones and a command ship, plus 10 modified fighters configured as deployment platforms, each carrying 5 remote-controlled boarding drones. And for General Wolf, 3 squads of assault drones and 3 commander units to control them. Very well. My fleet is currently stationed in the Phaeton 15 system. In 2 days, the Ronald, a new carrier leaving from Seoul, will be joining the 5th Strike Fleet. Captain First Class Clark will take your team and all your gear on board. I'll give him instructions to accommodate you and provide everything needed for your prep work. You'll operate from the carrier. It'll be the most practical option all around. Aboard the carrier, we stood out like sore thumbs against the sea of navy blue uniforms, crows in khaki drawing curious stares wherever we went. But it wasn't just us who caught attention. Our equipment stirred even more interest. The landing bots, modestly parked in one of the hangars, were largely ignored. But the unmanned fighter drones and the boarding drone carriers? Those had people circling them non-stop, trying not to stare too openly, yet clearly wondering what a bunch of army grunts were doing here, with gear that looked suspiciously like naval tech. Eventually, Captain Clark couldn't contain his curiosity and asked me in detail about the purpose of our systems. He made no effort to hide his skepticism, especially when it came to the idea of unmanned fighters. During one of the breaks between hyperspace jumps, he proposed a mock combat exercise, my machines against 10 of his fighters. Naturally, I didn't hesitate to agree. Trials like that were part of the testing process, and the more real-world scenarios we could simulate, the better for us. The only problem was that I had no one else to fly the command unit, and I was, to put it mildly, no ace pilot. Sure, I'd flown drop bots before, but that was a whole different beast. So, as expected, my own flying was rough. But the drones under my command performed decently. They followed pre-programmed combat algorithms, nothing fancy or adaptive, but they didn't make mistakes, could pull sharper maneuvers, and burn through ammo far more aggressively than human pilots dared. Our latest gen ECM systems helped too, throwing off enemy targeting just enough to give us an edge that we ran a classic head-on engagement scenario, weaving around the carrier as I marked priority targets and directed drone fire, trying to avoid getting tagged myself. I did alright for the most part, but lack of real space combat experience inevitably showed. In the end, Captain Clark's veteran pilots managed to take down my team. When I finally climbed out of the command unit and made my way to the carrier's command deck, Captain Clark looked pleased with himself. "You fought well, Lieutenant," he said, "but a 10 of 5 score doesn't exactly speak in favor of your tech." "With all due respect, Captain First Class," I replied, allowing myself a faint smile. "You might want to take a closer look at these." I tapped the insignia on my uniform. "You're looking at a ground forces lieutenant. A dirt rat, sir, not a fighter pilot. I was trained for a very different battlefield. And yet, in this mock battle, your flight group lost 5 trained pilots, while the opposing side lost just 1, and he was a self-taught amateur at that. Now imagine if someone like your best pilot had been flying the command unit instead of me." Clark grunted thoughtfully. That angle hadn't occurred to him. "Well, Lieutenant, you make a fair point. I'd like to have my people run trials on your equipment. Think that's possible?" "I was hoping you'd say that, Captain," I said. "After all, these systems were designed for you, for the fleet." We rendezvoused with the 5th Strike Fleet a week later. By then, 10 of the carrier's pilots had already completed training flights with our new machines, and the mock combat results changed accordingly. When I flew the command unit myself, supported by drones, we consistently lost to 10 manned fighters. But when both sides fielded professional pilots, the tide turned. On average, the piloted machines only won by sacrificing 7 to 9 of their number. After observing one of the exercises, Admiral Nelson let out a thoughtful grunt. "So, what does this mean, Lieutenant? 1 pilot and 9 drones can replace at least 7 manned fighters." "Affirmative, Admiral. That's exactly what the training data suggests. In other words, we coup." A sharp emergency alert cut him off mid-sentence. Nelson listened to the transmission, his face darkening. He barked clipped orders into his communicator. "Fleet to battle stations. Countdown to burn, 10 minutes. Then he turned back to us, his voice all business. "Gentlemen, the Roy have launched an attack on the Barnard star system. Single. Red dwarf in Ophiuchus, 6 light-years from Earth. The 4th Fleet is already engaged in planetary orbit. I'm returning to the flagship. Prepare for jump." Barnard's star, one of the inner systems of the Earth Federation. Its planets had been colonized long before the Roy invasion, and when the war began, we'd had plenty of time to fortify it thoroughly. It was around the orbital bastions of Barnard 1 and Barnard, for that the enemy's vanguard fleets had shattered during the war's 2nd year. And now, after an 18-year lull, the war had returned, this time in a much darker form. The Roy had never stood still. Their evolution was constant, always bringing new technologies, new weapons. But this time, they'd outdone themselves. Captain Clark assigned me a station in the carrier's command center, a spare console that I quickly outfitted with my control module for the boarding drone carriers. We dropped out of the final jump just over 3 million kilometers from Barnard S-axis orbit, and one of the operators couldn't hold back a stunned gasp. We all stared in tense silence at the tactical display blooming across the main holoscreen, struggling to comprehend what we were seeing. "The 4th Fleet is gone," Captain Clark said flatly, voicing the unthinkable. The planets were still holding, for now. The Federation had buried them in firepower, their orbits studded with 8 first-class fortresses each, instead of the standard 4. Several tactical strike groups from the 10th and 12th Fleets had managed to reinforce the system. The Admiralty couldn't strip those sectors bare, but they'd still sent what they could. Even so, the situation wasn't just threatening. It teetered on the edge of total catastrophe. First, the Roy Fleet had struck all 3 planets simultaneously. But the 4th Fleet, supported by orbital fortresses, must have inflicted heavy losses, because the enemy soon abandoned that tactic. After regrouping, they concentrated their assault on Barnard 3, the most densely populated planet in the system. It was there, in the brutal struggle for the planet's high orbit, that the last remnants of the 4th Fleet were destroyed. "There's an unusually high number of heavy warships in the enemy fleet," the senior analyst noted. 52 confirmed hulls, and the largest among them. Its class is unknown. "Put it on screen," The captain ordered that a third of the tactical display shifted, revealing the silhouette of a colossal battleship. The Earth Federation had never constructed anything like it, nor had the Roy, at least not until now. The vessel dwarfed the largest known dreadnoughts, easily 3 times the size. Its main guns, mounted along the central spine, were massive. At that moment, the behemoth was firing, its gun barrels lighting up with red-violet bursts of energy as it launched projectiles partially phased into hyperspace. This semi-phased state allowed the shells to travel at near-light speeds, but thankfully, they couldn't strike targets at those velocities. The laws of physics near significant gravitational fields prevented that. The rounds would shift into U mode a few dozen kilometers from the firing ship and revert to normal space at roughly the same distance from their target. By the time they reached their mark, they were moving at relatively ordinary speeds, just a few kilometers per second. The carrier's sensors couldn't yet resolve details on their own, but we were receiving live telemetry from ships already. Locked in combat, the 5th Strike Fleet was burning toward the battlefield at full thrust. With every new update added to the tactical map, the situation became more dire. The Roy fleet outnumbered us nearly 3-to-1 in heavy warships alone, not even counting the super battleship, which defied classification entirely. "He's taken a beating too," Captain Clark murmured, zooming in on a scorched section of the enemy hull. Chunks of armor plating had been blasted away, leaving ragged holes that could only have come from torpedoes or heavy kinetic impacts. "That's the result of the 4th Fleet's final counterattack," the analyst said grimly. Admiral Szymanski led it personally. He lost his remaining heavy ships and went down with his flagship. Right before our eyes, one of Barnard III's orbital fortresses shuddered from multiple heavy impacts. Its already damaged armor gave way, and an internal explosion tore through its core. Gouts of incandescent gas and glowing debris burst from the breaches as the structure cracked apart. Chunks of the fortress drifted slowly, by cosmic standards, trailing splinters of internal superstructure and sheared-off armor plates to Roy's main forces, which had been holding position at a cautious distance from the planet, now activated their primary drives. They began maneuvering toward the breach in the planet's defenses. 3 battleships and more than a dozen cruisers from the 10th and 12th fleets repositioned themselves to intercept the advance, but the imbalance of forces made one thing painfully clear: they wouldn't be able to hold the line for long. The 5th Strike Fleet arrived just in time, though with its current strength, all it could realistically do was delay the inevitable. The Roy super battleship was steadily accelerating, closing in on the planet, and Admiral Nelson had to decide on his next move. Not that he had much of a choice. Retreat wasn't an option. He lacked both the authority and the will to give that order. All that remained was to drag as many of the enemy down into oblivion as possible. "Order the orbital fortresses to reposition," the Admiral commanded, dragging their icons into new coordinates on the tactical projection. The maneuver would help seal the breach in the defense line, but those armored behemoths would need over an hour to get there. Have the carriers Cobra and Ronald launch their torpedo bombers. I want full fighter escort for them. Target: enemy flagship. Battleships: engage Roy's line ships directly. Cruisers: hold the flanks and block any light enemy units from breaching our formation. 3rd Destroyer Division: simulate an assault on their carriers, disrupt their fighter launch patterns. Fleet captains echoed the Admiral's orders, adding their own specifics within their chains of command. When Captain Clark had finished issuing directives to his subordinates, I approached him. "Captain, permission to deploy boarding drone carriers along with the bombers. The enemy flagship has visible breaches in its armor. It might be a viable entry point for my bots." "Permission granted. You don't report directly to me, Lieutenant. Just do your job." "I've got my hands full with mine." "Aye, sir," I replied formally, then switched to my squad's comms channel. "Inga, prep the drones for launch. Tell the techs to ready our 10 fighters and the drone carriers." "You're going out there?" Inga's voice crackled back. "Someone has to cover the boarding carriers. Clark's pilots won't have time. They'll be busy clearing a path for the torpedo run. And who's going to control the drones once they're inside?" "You will. You'll stay here on the carrier and guide the bots during infiltration. I trained you for this. You handled it fine during the sims. After that, when I give the signal, You'll take the squad and the dropships and board the enemy flagship. But not a moment before I say so. Jumping in early is suicide. Understood. What exactly are we supposed to do once we're inside? There won't be many drones. Not enough to take a ship like that on their own. If everything goes right, I'll give the order. If it doesn't, then it doesn't. But you don't move without my signal. Not one step. Got it. Understood, Commander. She answered grimly and cut the channel. The darkness of space pressed in on me from all sides. The tactical projection inside the command fighter offered a decent sense of what was happening around us. But still, I was no spaceman. Battles in space, or even just flying through it, wasn't my thing. Sure, I could enjoy the view as a passenger. I'd even honestly admire the dazzling swirls of galaxies and nebulae, the bleak beauty of asteroid fields, and the raging firestorms of stellar prominences. But planets felt more like home. That's where I belonged, and I always found myself wanting to return there as soon as possible. The battle flared up again with renewed fury. The arrival of the Fifth Strike Fleet had shifted the balance, prompting the Roy Fleet to change formation. They abandoned their frontal assault and began forming heavy flanking columns, maneuvering to encircle Admiral Nelson's core forces. Only their massive flagship stayed its course. Escorted by a handful of cruisers, it kept driving straight through the center, pushing closer to the planet, almost as if it were targeting the coordinates once occupied by the destroyed orbital fortress. I had a strong suspicion about their intent. That maneuver wasn't just about brute force. It was a calculated attempt to prevent Admiral Nelson from regrouping his heavy ships. And if that worked, it would allow Roy's flanks to strike in perfect unison. If my estimation was right, our fleet might not survive such a blow. Clearly, Roy's commanders believed their flagship could endure the full brunt of our heavy guns long enough to see it through. That explained the audacity. We were closing in on the enemy fast. Fighters are fast and agile things. The boarding drone carriers stayed close together in a tight formation. Inga was controlling their trajectory from the carrier, guiding them toward a dead zone in the Roy flagship's point defense coverage. There was still some distance to cover. The first wave of fighters from the Cobra had already engaged Roy's own interceptors, clearing the way for the torpedo bombers. Losses on both sides were about even, but Roy hadn't yet managed to put up a proper screen, and at this point, it seemed they wouldn't have the time to do so. Realizing their fighters wouldn't hold, Roy's commander dispatched around 15 destroyers to reinforce the flagship. These smaller ships were fast and well-armed, more than capable of tangling with fighters thanks to their maneuverability. But that agility came at a cost. They were fragile. A destroyer had no place slugging it out near battleships or cruisers. One well-placed salvo from a capital ship, and a destroyer turned into drifting wreckage scattered across random vectors. Admiral Nelson knew this well. Breaking off momentarily from his engagement with the enemy cruisers shielding the flagship, the battleships of the Fifth Strike Fleet delivered 2 perfectly timed volleys. In seconds, the path ahead was swept clear for our fighters. Still, a few enemy fighters managed to break through and reach the relatively sluggish torpedo bombers. Those bombers could maneuver well enough under capital ship fire, but they stood little chance against agile fighter assaults. My drone carriers would have been easy prey too, if Roy's commanders had known what was hiding inside those outdated frames. But they didn't. The enemy fighters paid them little attention, dismissing the formation of old, silent ships as irrelevant. Their focus was squarely on the torpedo bombers, and that's exactly where they struck that we lost 7 out of 30. But the Cobra's fighter pilots brought down every last enemy that had broken through. I couldn't hear what Captain Clark was yelling on the command channel. I didn't have access, but I'm sure the squadron leaders got quite the earful. Probably learned a few things about themselves they didn't know before. Despite the losses, we reached the enemy flagship and entered the kill zone of its direct defensive systems. Autocannons and short-range missile launchers lined its armored hull like thorns. A swarm of small-caliber shells and smart missiles came our way. I wasn't too worried. Our electronic warfare systems outclassed anything Roy had faced before. Their scanners could barely make out our outlines, and their guidance systems kept losing lock. Since neither my fighters nor the drone carriers had actively engaged in the fight so far, Roy's systems shifted focus toward the more obvious threats. The Cobras and Ronald's fighters, especially the torpedo bombers. From Roy's perspective, they were the only ones that posed a real danger to the flagship. I stopped tracking the overall battle. We were nearing the stern of the massive dreadnought, where I knew its armor had been damaged. Soon it would be my turn to act. The surviving torpedo bombers fired a coordinated volley and immediately peeled away to retreat. The ship's defensive systems stopped tracking them and focused instead on the 25 torpedoes closing in. They didn't manage to shoot them all down, for binary warheads struck the hull. Only 2 detonations breached the armor, and even that likely didn't do serious damage to a ship of such scale. But one of those breaches looked promising. The impact had blown apart a patch of armor dozens of meters wide, opening up a breach into the ship's interior. A mix of gas and debris from the blast was venting out into space, quickly freezing in the vacuum. Inga, it's time. I marked the breach on the tactical map and sent the coordinates to the carrier. The drone carriers adjusted course sharply, closing the distance to the enemy flagship. The ship's point defense systems tried to respond, but then my fighter drones, previously passive, suddenly banked hard and dove in, guns blazing, launching missiles directly at the Roy ship. They couldn't hurt a dreadnought, of course, not even close. But that wasn't the point. The real objective was to draw fire. And it worked. The automated defenses prioritized the sudden aggressive threat. 9 of my fighters were obliterated in seconds, their shattered hulls clattering against the thick armor of the Roy dreadnought. But it bought the time I needed. All 10 drone carriers managed to release their payload before being shredded by the guns. Nathan, the boarding drones have reached the enemy hull. Inga's focused voice came through the combat helmet. I've given the order to breach. At this point, I was just a bystander. Inga had full control of the boarding operation. To override her and take command, I need to be on board the enemy dreadnought myself, and suited up in my specialized power armor, the same one from the Proxima operation, which my engineers kept upgrading every time they finalized a new system. But now I was stuck floating in my command pod, holding position close to the massive enemy ship, hidden behind the noise wall thrown up by our electronic warfare units, barely daring to move. The rest of my group was gone. The fighters had pulled away, escorting the torpedo bombers back home. Contact with the enemy, Inga reported. The drones encountered repair bots working on the damaged site. Hostiles neutralized. Advancing. The space battle still raged on. I watched the tactical display as friendly and enemy blips disappeared. Ours, unfortunately, more often. Another orbital fortress was lost, crushed under the firepower of Roy's monstrous flagship. The battleship New York fell silent and drifted out of the fight. Cruisers and destroyers were being wiped out by the dozen. Far off from the main engagement, the landing transports held formation, ready to either make a jump out of the system or drop troops onto the planetary surface in support of ground forces. If only I had you here, boys, I thought, glancing at the markers for General Wolf's ships. But no landing craft could punch through the wall of enemy dreadnoughts and cruisers. Spectrone 3 has located a target access port. Ingus. Update snapped me back. I've authorized interface. The drone reports successful deployment of the Adaptive Network Breach Protocol. Each drone carrier held 5 boarding drones, 4 combat configured, and 1 built purely for cyber operations. I'd have been a fool not to exploit our extensive experience working with captured Roy tech. A capital ship wasn't exactly the same as a lesser Serpent or a boarding pod, but the fundamentals still held. Now, that spider-like drone, tiny even compared to the combat units, had used its scanners to locate a tech port beneath the external plating of a service corridor. Its manipulators made quick work of the interface, and in moments it was inside the enemy's network. New contact. This time, it's live troops, Inga said. Roy crew in suits came to investigate. Hostiles eliminated. No resistance. Looks like they weren't even armed. Boarding drones don't take prisoners. They operate in one of 2 modes, raid or capture. If the mission isn't to seize the ship, they're programmed to do as much internal damage as possible, destroying key systems and eliminating crew. But if taking the ship is the objective, the crew becomes the priority target. We're in the network. There was triumph in Inga's voice now. What are your orders, Commander? What do we tell the drone to do next? I was honestly scared. To break radio silence. Sure, the electronic warfare stations were doing their job, but any activity on the comms Well, that was still a risk. I had no choice, though. I aligned the directional antenna, recorded my message, and sent a compact data burst to the Ronald. Inga, tell the drone to seize control of the Dreadnought's point defense systems, at least in my sector. I need to get on board myself. Otherwise, I'm useless. On it. And then I waited. Of course, Roy picked up on the transmission. They didn't intercept it, but they definitely noticed something. My EW console started to squeal, a warning that I was being actively scanned by the Dreadnought. The flak cannons began to stir. They couldn't lock onto me precisely, but they had the general direction pinned down. If they opened up with everything they had, I'd have to dodge, and that meant giving up stealth. The nearest flak turret let loose with a burst. It passed wide, but Roy wasn't done yet. The next few salvos came closer. At least 10 guns were firing now. The latest one hit so near that I knew the next would find me. I kicked the engines into overdrive and shifted position, but it was obvious I wasn't going to make it in time. The cannons tracked me smoothly, following my maneuvering. Arc and then froze. Sector PDS under control, Inga reported brightly. Thanks, darling. I said under my breath without keying the mic. I owe you a cookie the size of this dreadnought. The breach in the hull was just big enough for my fighter. I eased it into the opening and brought it down gently onto a warped deck. The breaching charge had done its job nicely, and though it was hard to tell whether I'd landed in a hangar or a storage bay, the gravity field was still active and stable. I'd never stripped and suited up so fast in my life. Sure, they drilled us endlessly on this process, but nothing motivates like actual incoming fire. Inga, can you hear me? More or less, came the reply from the Ronald, crackling through static and distortion. The low-power relay system wasn't designed for this range, but it was working. Barely. Transfer control of the boarding drones to me and stand by for my signal. Get our boys to the dropships. Full readiness. I shifted my entire focus to the drones. Their steady advance through the dreadnought had stalled. If Roy had bothered to design even basic anti-boarding countermeasures into these ships, our spider bots would have been reduced to scrap long ago. There simply weren't enough of them for a ship this size. But boarding wasn't part of Roy's combat doctrine, and their crews were armed only with light sidearms. Still, thick emergency bulkheads were more than enough to isolate unarmed intruders in any captured section. Roy could have held us off like that for hours, but I had something else, something nastier, quieter, and a lot harder to stop. It was crawling, inch by inch, through their digital defenses, trying to reach the ship's control systems. I dove into the special drone logs to check what I had access to. Without guidance, the bots were breaking into anything and everything, from mainframe nodes to the dam sanitation subsystems. Sure, locking down the enemy's toilets for good could ruin their morale, but that wasn't quite the effect I was going for here. I recalibrated their efforts and slaved the drone hacks to my own suit's enhanced electronics, the same gear I'd used to hijack a Roy landing craft back on Proxima. That gave things a boost. 15 minutes later, I opened a channel to the Ronald again. Inga, it's time. I've locked down the flagship's self-destruct system. Now we can take it warm. What's the situation on your end? Will you be able to bring 3 of our bots here? By the time you arrive, the Dreadnought's point defense will be completely silent. Bad situation, Commander. Roy's taken down 2 more fortresses and flanked us. Our battleships are barely holding on. The enemy's destroyers will be at our carriers soon. But we'll make it. We've closed the distance, so get ready for a visit. I'll be waiting. It's all gone quiet without you. I'm already in the hangar. We're launching now. See you soon. Nathan. Inga ended the call, and I once again dove into trying to hijack the dreadnought. The crew was a nuisance. They could see what was happening with their networks and control blocks, and were actively trying to fight back by switching certain posts to manual. But there's no way you can manually control a complex machine like a dreadnought. And we kept battling, constantly pushing the situation toward an invisible point of equilibrium. The flagship of the 5th Strike Fleet, the newest dreadnought Paris, was still holding out. Half of its main gun turrets were silent, but the ship still maintained speed and maneuverability. The damage control systems were struggling, but they were keeping up, for now. In the ship's most secure room, the command center, Admiral Nelson continued to manage the battle. He no longer cared about the forecasted probabilities from the analysts. The enemy's chance of victory is 92%. The admiral repeated. Shove it. Anyway, Cobra, how many bombers do you still have operational? I need Roy's 14th banner to stop attacking the 5th fortress, or it won't last another half hour. Sir, Admiral, the space control officer interrupted, pulling the commander's attention away from the battle. The flagship's fire intensity has dropped by 40%. All of its weapons appear intact, but many of the turrets have stopped firing. Who's closest to them? Have them report the situation. Investigate the issue and report back with a summary. Understood. I opened the external airlock of the technical hangar in the area under my control for Inga's bots. The Dreadnought's point defense was securely blocked by my drones. The battle over the scanning systems was tough, but I managed to hinder the detection of the landing bots, who were already well camouflaged by the best EW stations in the world. It was fortunate that a kind of vacuum had formed around Roy's flagship. By throwing it into the attack on our center, Roy had practically sacrificed the protection of his super dreadnought. The ship could withstand the fire from our heavy battleships, but the cruisers, and especially the destroyers, were quickly destroyed. In such a large-scale battle, such losses were to be expected, especially since the objective justified the sacrifices. And Roy had done their job, tying down the 5th Strike Fleet, which was why Admiral Nelson was now facing serious trouble due to the flanking attack. But in the end, the enemy flagship had been left isolated. The landing bots touched down on the hangar deck, and the heavy but silent footsteps of the assault drones, vibrating through the hull, signaled the arrival of Inga's squad. The 2nd drone unit was led by Fulton, and the 3rd by Jasvinder. I had chosen to bring along battle-tested comrades, and, as it turned out, that was the right decision. The armament of the assault drones didn't compare to the guns of the small boarders. When designing the boarding robots, I had aimed for minimal size so they could slip into any gap, technical well, or ventilation shaft, but I hadn't anticipated that they would have to take control of such a giant, whose internal emergency bulkheads were nearly as thick as an enemy destroyer's hull. But now things were moving. I managed to lift some of the bulkheads by taking control of their control systems, but many were sealed manually, making that approach impossible. However, it turned out that anti-tank missiles worked pretty well as lockpicks. Well, not on the first try, but by the 3rd. In short, we were advancing, and each new communication node we captured gave me more options for deeper penetration into the Dreadnought's control system. The 5th orbital fortress couldn't be saved. A desperate attack by 8 torpedo bombers, covered by the remnants of the Cobra aircraft carrier's fighter wing, inflicted heavy damage on the enemy Dreadnought. But to replace the ship that had exited the battle, Roy sent 3 cruisers, which finished off the 5th fortress with combined salvos in 40 minutes. Now, over the southern hemisphere of Barnard 3, there was only a single semi-destroyed fortress remaining, surrounded by the remnants of the 5th Strike Fleet and several surviving ships from the 10th and 12th fleets. Sir, the enemy flagship has ceased firing. It's continuing its approach to the planet, but isn't maneuvering or shooting, the operator reported. Analysts, what's going on? Or are you only capable of counting the chances of our defeat? Admiral Nelson barked. There's information. From the Ronald aircraft carrier. The senior analyst replied quickly. At the beginning of the battle, its air group accompanied the torpedo bombers in their attack on the enemy flagship. Lieutenant Briggs joined the attackers with his experimental machines. Then, about an hour ago, apparently by Briggs' orders, the carrier sent his subordinates on 3 drones. Throughout the battle, Lieutenant Briggs maintained contact with his men aboard the Wellington. We couldn't find anything else. Briggs again. Admiral Nelson grinned maliciously. Wherever he shows up, strange things happen. Let's see what happens this time. FFF. Clark, what's going on with you? We've been attacked by enemy destroyers, sir. Engaging in battle. Captain Clark shouted back from the Ronald. Retreat immediately. Cruiser Washington. Leave the formation and cover Clark's retreat. A massive warship always comes with a large crew, and most of them know their vessel like the back of their hand. Roy's soldiers weren't cowards, far from it. Caught off guard by the sudden turn of events, they still resisted. Fiercely, throwing up barricades, sealing off sections, even laying improvised mines in the corridors using anti-aircraft shells. None of this homemade defense could truly stop us, of course, but it did slow us down. And every minute we lost inside the thick hull of the enemy ship meant more of our people were dying out there in space. Still, we were making progress. I hadn't yet gained control over the main battery guns, but Roy had already lost it. At some point, it became clear, without access to the command bridge, I'd never achieve full control over the ship. Once again, the rigid chain of command so typical of Roy's society got in the way. Not one of their soldiers could even imagine that command could come from anywhere other than the central post. Their entire system was designed around that assumption. Many commands physically couldn't be issued from any other location. Hardware-level blockages. Roy must have thrown everything they had into holding the command level. The main corridor leading there was blocked by a barricade built from hastily dismantled heavy machinery. And behind it stood an anti-aircraft cannon, probably dragged in from the reserve storage, or maybe even unbolted directly from the ship's hull. The first pair of assault drones that poked their heads and were instantly shredded. That gun packed serious punch. But even that was a last-ditch move, born of desperation. What could unarmored crewmen in standard suits really do? Even with a serious gun, nothing but die bravely. And Roy's troops managed that. They earned my respect. I'd wager even the sound of their own gunfire in the tight corridors left their ears ringing. And when one of our anti-tank rockets tore through the hallway and exploded near the barricade, they were done for. After that, 3 of our assault drones rushed in, and the only return fire they met was a wild, panicked burst that tore up the ceiling and one wall. Seconds later, it was over. That was it. The ship was finally ours. Admiral Nelson stared grimly at the projection screen, watching as the last orbital fortress over the planet's southern hemisphere broke apart during re-entry, burning up in the dense atmosphere of Barnard 3. Even this iron-willed admiral seemed unable to watch the death of his fleet, or perhaps the beginning of the end of his entire civilization. Without flinching, the strategic outlook was bleak. Roy still had 14 battleships, 8 cruisers, 3 carriers, and around 50 smaller vessels in fighting condition. And behind them loomed a vast fleet of assault transports, ready to descend on the planets as soon as the path was cleared. True, nearly all of Roy's ships had suffered major damage, but most still had fight left in them. And then there was the enemy flagship, still drifting silently toward the planet. No one knew what was happening inside. Admiral Nelson had just 3 battleships left, barely holding together. Of those, only his own Paris still posed any real threat. 9 cruisers remained operational to varying degrees, but none could stand against a force of superior enemy battleships. The carrier Cobra, damaged during the destroyer assault, was now hiding behind the line ships alongside its sister ship, Ronald, under the protection of 24 destroyers and corvettes. Meanwhile, Roy's fleet was methodically regrouping, clearly preparing for one final, decisive blow to wipe out what remained of Earth's navy. And they had every reason to believe they'd succeed. The admiral faced a grim choice. He could fight, knowing full well there was no chance of victory. Or he could retreat to the far side of the planet, where 3 orbital fortresses were still intact. But doing so would open the door for Roy's landing forces to sweep down upon the heavily populated surface of Barnard. 3. Unbeknownst to him, Admiral Nelson was now grappling with the very same dilemma Lieutenant Briggs had once faced. But Nelson got lucky. He didn't have to make the call. Transmission from Roy's flagship, the communications officer called out, startled. Put it through. The projection screen flickered, revealing a room filled with unfamiliar equipment. In an alien design, standing at what looked like a spatial control console was Lieutenant Briggs, clad in the heavy armor of a frontline assault trooper, visor raised. The twin barrels of an autocannon and a rotary gun loomed over his shoulders, absurdly out of place in a starship's command center. Behind him, in the hallway, a light combat bot, Scalpel, paced impatiently, seemingly too large to fit through the door. Admiral, Briggs said with calm precision, the enemy flagship is under our control. Please assign our place in the fleet formation and a combat tasking. Nelson said nothing. This boy had done the impossible for the Earth Federation again. Admiral, the spatial operations officer interrupted. Roy's ships are on the move. How much control do you have over the vessel, Lieutenant? I can execute basic maneuvers, fire all main battery guns, and, if needed, Engage with missiles and torpedoes, Admiral. All point defense systems are set to automatic mode. Overall damage is manageable, but I advise avoiding torpedo strikes if possible. Sending coordinates now. You are assigned to the center line. One last thing. What would you like to name the ship, Lieutenant? Zeus, Admiral. Briggs answered after a brief pause. Well then, Lieutenant Briggs, Zeus is a fine name for your ship. When I fired up the main engines and clumsily slid into formation with the shattered remnants of the 5th Strike Fleet, the Roy fleet flinched. Their ships drifted, aimless for a few seconds, then suddenly scrambled, aligning into a new attack formation. The patient, deliberate pace was gone. They were coming. I checked the ammunition load for the main battery and gave a short grunt of satisfaction. Still plenty left. A new order came through from the Admiral. Concentrate all fire on the least damaged enemy battleship. As soon as the Dreadnought's absurdly overcomplicated targeting system finally locked on, I gave the order. Main guns, fire. The range was still too great, and accuracy left much to be desired, but I managed to score 2 hits nonetheless. A battleship, of course, is no destroyer. Even rounds as heavy as mine couldn't tear it apart with a single strike. The enemy ship shuddered, veered slightly off course, but kept its speed and stayed in the fight. So far, I was the only one firing. None of our other ships had the range to reach their targets. It was as if Roy had changed completely. Gone was the cold, calculating predator we were used to. What we faced now was a rabid beast, charging blindly, throwing everything aside in its path. The fall of their flagship must have meant something critical, something sacred, even, and Roy was now willing to pay any price to ensure this mighty vessel didn't remain in enemy hands. They advanced in their typical formation, battleships. And the least damaged cruisers formed a disc-like shield at the front, with smaller or more damaged ships following in a second line. Behind those, flanked by destroyers and corvettes, came the carriers. None of their guns were aimed at Admiral Nelson's fleet. Every barrel was trained on me. Despite my clumsy attempts at evasive maneuvers, Zeus rocked again and again from heavy impacts. Not all the shells breached the armor. Those that did mostly struck secondary compartments near the hull. Still, each hit disabled more of the close-range defense systems, anti-air guns, missile silos, torpedo tubes. Bit by bit, Zeus was becoming dangerously exposed in close combat. I was starting to realize with growing clarity we couldn't let Roy get close. Admiral, I called over the comms, requesting permission to shift fire to the enemy carriers. They're within range, and if they launch a wave of aircraft, Zeus won't be able to stop them. Divert 20% of your main battery to engage the carriers, Nelson replied almost instantly. Keep the rest trained on their battleships. 2nd Destroyer Division, form a screen around Zeus. You're now responsible for intercepting any enemy aircraft that break through. It was a risky call, and I remembered well what happened to Roy's own destroyers when they tried to protect their carriers under the guns of our heavy ships. But Roy seemed blind now. They saw nothing but their lost flagship. Nelson was betting everything on that madness. The distance between us continued to shrink. Now unchallenged by the enemy, Nelson's battleships fired at will, not even bothering to maneuver like a live-fire drill. Enemy pennants blinked out one by one on the tactical display. But Zeus was taking a beating. The bombardment grew heavier by the minute. Out of the 10 massive main gun turrets, only 7 remained operational. Repeated strikes to already weakened hull segments were causing critical damage. Even with all the key systems redundantly shielded, the ship was becoming increasingly sluggish and unresponsive. Eventually, I gave up trying to maneuver at all. At this range, it no longer made any difference to the accuracy of enemy fire that I managed to take out one of their carriers. I don't know exactly where the shell hit, but the Roy vessel swelled from the inside, bursting into a blinding starburst that dissolved within seconds into a dim cloud of gas and dust, quickly fading into the vacuum of space. Still, the 2 remaining carriers managed to launch their torpedo bombers and fighters despite the damage they'd taken. From that point on, the carriers no longer held my attention. Without waiting for new orders, I redirected the guns I had trained on them back toward Roy's remaining heavy ships. Not that they had many left. The last of Roy's battleships were little more than broken silhouettes. Three twisted hulks that barely retained their original form, drifting toward us as uncontrolled heaps of metal, occasionally flickering with gunfire from a few surviving turrets. The Fifth Strike Fleet had more than enough firepower left to mop up what remained. But I wasn't concerned with enemy capital ships anymore. I was watching the torpedo bombers. There were far more of them than I expected. Either Roy had been holding them in reserve, or they simply hadn't found an opening to deploy them until now. But here they came, 55 torpedo bombers, flanked by 100 fighters, all heading straight for Zeus. I seriously doubted my escort of 10 destroyers could stop them. Admiral Nelson seemed to grasp the danger just as clearly. "Captain Briggs, cancel all previous target priorities," he ordered. "Concentrate suppressive fire on incoming aircraft. Use your main battery." It was a desperate move. Battleship-grade weapons were never meant to counter swarms. Yes, if you had enough guns, like I did, they might make a dent, but they were still utterly inadequate for shooting down fighters and torpedo planes. "Admiral," I replied, unwilling to stand idle and wait for the slaughter to begin. "Request permission to execute an evasive maneuver toward the northern hemisphere of Barnard 3. 3 orbital fortresses are still operational there. If I can reach cover behind them, Roy's air squadrons are in for a nasty surprise. There's a high probability the enemy will pursue Zeus, which would allow you to hit them with flanking fire." Under normal circumstances, my proposal would have been reckless. But Nelson had seen the same thing I had. Roy was obsessed with Zeus, locked on like a predator with only one target in sight, ignoring everything else. He decided to take the gamble. "Permission granted," he said. "Second Destroyer Division, follow Zeus and provide cover against torpedo bombers." Zeus engines were undamaged, and though our reactor was only outputting 70% of its rated power, the maneuver was brisk enough. Roy had packed their new flagship with the very best of their latest tech, and it showed. Of course, a battleship couldn't outrun fighters or torpedo planes, but I wasn't about to waste this narrow window. Though to be honest, the odds weren't on my side. Every calculation told me I wouldn't make it in time. I knew it. Roy knew it, which only made them press harder in pursuit of what had once been the crown jewel of their fleet. But I never liked space. I've always preferred planets, felt more at home near them. So instead of arcing wide around Barnard 3, I steered my massive ship into the atmosphere. "Lieutenant Briggs, what in God's name are you doing?" Admiral Nelson's voice thundered over the comms. "Executing an evasive maneuver, Admiral," I replied smoothly, polite in tone, if not in substance. The massive warship shuddered beneath me, the familiar tremble of atmospheric entry crawling up through the frame. Familiar and oddly comforting to someone who had spent more of his life in gravity than void. Let them chase us down to low orbit. Down there, they'll be greeted by anti-orbital missile batteries and planetary defense bots itching for action. "You're a damn fool, Captain Briggs. I'm starting to question whether giving you command was a mistake," Nelson grumbled. But I didn't hear genuine disapproval in his voice. And, notably, no order came through to abort the maneuver. Zeus groaned under the strain, bucking and rattling like a bronco diving into the gravity well. From the surface, I imagined, it must have been quite a show, a battleship big enough to cast its own eclipse tearing through the upper atmosphere in a trail of fire and fury. I envied the spectators of my little performance. Speed dropped off sharply, and the enemy quickly closed the distance, more rapidly now than at any point since the chase began. But that didn't matter. The battlefield had changed. Now they could only come at me from above, from space. I dipped just enough into the atmosphere to shield the most damaged side of Zeus, keeping it turned planetward where no fire could reach it. The destroyers escorting us had wisely stayed in space, but even they benefited from the compressed threat vectors. Ground command channels were already buzzing, planetary forces begging for target data. I gladly fed them a stream of sensor feeds. So when the first wave of Roy's attack craft came within torpedo range, they met a wall of fire, hundreds of anti-orbital missiles streaking upward from the surface. It was glorious. The troops who'd spent the entire space battle grounded seemed euphoric to finally contribute. They launched everything they had. Even atmospheric fighters scrambled to join the fray, flying at the edge of their operational ceiling, passing just kilometers beneath Zeus, and firing at anything they could lock onto. Their effectiveness was minimal, sure, but at least they disrupted enemy targeting. Still, Roy knew how to fight. Even in the grip of the blind fury that had overtaken them after losing their flagship, they struck with brutal precision. Zeus took 15 torpedo hits. 15. Even for a battleship of this size, that was severe. Our power output plummeted to 40%, and barely half our main guns remained operational. Hull plating, already compromised by atmospheric drag, began to peel away from the ship like dead skin that I knew Zeus couldn't take much more. I pulled her gently back into orbit, bleeding speed and altitude but still intact, while I danced this desperate gambit. Admiral Nelson made the most of it. His ships, blessed by the narrowed front and enemy distraction, methodically wiped out what was left of Roy's fleet. By the time I reached the protective shadow of an orbital fortress in the planet's northern hemisphere, there was nothing left for them to shoot at. Roy's warships were gone, and their invasion fleet, still idle throughout the entire battle, finally spun up their drives and jumped out of the system, tails tucked. The last of Roy's strike craft, fighters and torpedo bombers, were stranded. With their carriers destroyed and Zeus shielded by the orbital fortresses, there was nowhere left to go. Still, they didn't surrender. Every last one of them died in a final, suicidal charge against the fortress that had saved my ship. Admiral, evasive maneuver completed. Ship's combat readiness is at 35%, I reported to Nelson, awaiting further instructions. Congratulations on the victory, gentlemen, the Admiral announced over the open channel, ignoring my report entirely. We paid a high price for it, too high, but it's a victory nonetheless. All ship commanders are to report their losses and damages within the hour and begin evacuation of the wounded to planetary hospitals. I waited for the Admiral's orders. I saw no reason to remain aboard the Zeus for long. Yes, technically I'd been appointed commander of this massive warship, but that didn't change the fact that I had ended up here by accident, a man with no real ties to the Navy. Then again, no one but me could operate a dreadnought like this, which meant Admiral Nelson had a difficult decision to make. What to do with me and my trophy. 2 hours later, he made up his mind. Lieutenant Briggs, he called me on a secure channel. You report that the ship's propulsion systems are operational. Can you carry out a series of jumps back to Earth? Yes, Admiral. Technically I can, but my knowledge of hyperspace navigation is severely lacking. I'll need a specialist aboard. I'll send you a temporary crew, Lieutenant. Navigators included. And frankly, that ship could use some cleanup. Corpses of the enemy scattered through the compartments don't exactly improve livability. For escort, you'll be accompanied by 3 destroyers and the carriers Cobra and Ronald. Without fighters or torpedo bombers, they're not much use elsewhere. Admiral Fulton will be in command of the convoy. He'll be aboard the Cobra. We were met in the solar system by destroyers from the Metropolis fleet and escorted to the Martian shipyards. Naturally, Zeus wouldn't fit into any dry dock, but no one even tried. To my surprise, it wasn't the Navy who contacted me first. It was Army General Barrington, who immediately began asking strange questions. Mr. Briggs, he said, getting to the point after offering a cursory congratulations. How exactly do you plan to dispose of your rather monumental prize? General, I replied, allowing a hint of confusion into my voice. How else can I dispose of it besides turning it over to the Navy's Prize Recovery Division? So you haven't spoken with your legal team yet? Well, I understand you. Just got out of combat. Still fine. Let me clarify the situation myself. The thing is, you boarded the Cobra not by command order but, shall we say, on your own initiative. And not as Lieutenant Nathan Briggs either. After all, no one would honor such a request from a mere assault lieutenant. You and your people joined the 5th Strike Fleet as part of a contractual arrangement to test new technology. You acted not as soldiers or officers of the Earth Federation Army, but as the head of the Briggs Arms Company and the specialists you personally recruited. All your equipment, by the way, was company-owned, not military property. You were never supposed to take part in any real combat. As per the agreement, your mission was strictly non-combat field testing. But when the swarm attacked the Barnard Star system, everything changed. You, again, entirely on your own initiative, joined the Carrier Strike Group's assault, which ultimately led to the capture of the enemy flagship. And then you voluntarily joined the Fifth Strike Fleet under Admiral Nelson's command. I listened to General Barrington and had to muster every ounce of willpower just to keep my jaw from dropping to the floor. It was growing heavier by the second, threatening to crash down with a thud at any moment, but I held firm. Meanwhile, the general continued. So here's the picture that emerges. The CEO and personnel of the Briggs Arms Company, during the battle at Barnard, 3, used their own equipment and weapons to seize a state-of-the-art enemy vessel and then proceeded to personally destroy 4 enemy battleships and a carrier. In addition, in coordination with the Fifth Strike Fleet, you helped eliminate another 10 enemy battleships and a significant number of lighter warships. Your actions secured a Federation victory in a major engagement and prevented the enemy from capturing a densely populated planet. Incidentally, I should congratulate you, Mr. Briggs. You'll get official notice soon enough, but you and your team have already been declared honorary citizens of the planet Lantana. That's the local name for Barnard, 3. I serve the Earth Federation. I replied in a wooden voice, still fighting the gravitational pull of my own jaw. Now, let's talk about what all this means going forward, the general said. Mr. Briggs, the enemy warship you captured is, by all legal standards, the property of the Briggs Arms Company, of which you are the head. Moreover, every expense your company incurred during the battle for Barnard, 3, is to be reimbursed by the Ministry of Defense. And I assure you, they'll be delighted to do so. Because if it weren't for your participation, our losses in equipment, personnel, and resources would have reached figures that would make this reimbursement look like a first grader's lunch allowance. But, hold on, Mr. Briggs, I'm not finished. For the destruction of 5 enemy first-rate warships, and 4, your active role in eliminating an entire fleet's worth of enemy vessels, your company is entitled to a bonus. The exact amount is still being calculated, but rest assured, it will exceed your compensation several times over. My mind raced. Sure, I needed the money, but I hadn't gone to war for that. On the other hand, refusing would be foolish. After all, I was going to use those funds to develop new weapons for the military. And judging by Barrington's tone, he understood that perfectly and was more than happy to provide the resources, fully expecting to receive even better tech. In return, I'll repeat my question, Mr. Briggs. What do you intend to do with the Zeus battleship? That depends on the needs of the fleet, General. I answered after a moment's thought. If the fleet needs a ship like that, the Briggs Arms Company is ready to take on its repair and retrofitting at the Defense Ministry's request, and afterward, we'll transfer the ship to the Navy. Transfer? The general smirked. You're forgetting the status of your prize again. Not transfer, sell. And by the way, the damage sustained by the Zeus during the battle also falls under your reimbursable expenses. After all, when you took that ship into combat, it was already the property of your company. As such, about 80% of the repair costs will be covered by the Ministry of Defense. And yes, the fleet is very much interested in acquiring your prize. It will be thoroughly studied, commissioned under the Federation flag, and used as the prototype for an entirely new class of battleship. The President received me at his country residence. A spacious and elegant park, with the presidential palace buildings seamlessly integrated into the landscape, made a pleasant impression on me. Given the remarkably sunny weather, our meeting was held in an open pavilion. It was hard to believe that this place had once been buried under kilometers of ice. Mr. Briggs, the Commander-in-Chief of the Earth Federation's armed forces, greeted me with a warm smile. It's a pleasure to see you again. The pleasure is mine, Mr. President, I replied, shaking the head of state's hand and accepting his chosen tone, one that omitted military ranks entirely. Your recent operation left a deep impression on all of us, Tomlinson said quietly. Let's sit down. They'll bring us some tea shortly, with my favorite ginger cookies. We have much to talk about, Mr. Briggs. I silently followed the only marshal in the Earth Federation's military. The cookies turned out to be genuinely delicious, and the tea, brewed from Highland herbs, was unexpectedly good that I sipped the tea with pleasure, listening to the head of state, who seemed in no rush to steer the conversation into serious territory. The president clearly hadn't been sleeping much lately and was visibly worn down. I did my best to keep our conversation light, allowing Tomlinson a few moments of calm before diving into weightier matters. Mr. Briggs, The president eventually said, getting to the point. This past year, you've done more for the Earth Federation than anyone else. You're an officer who doesn't shy away from risk, who finds a way out of impossible situations. And though you're also the owner of a private company, it's clear to me, and to everyone around me, that profit is only a secondary concern for you. It matters only insofar as it helps you achieve your goals. So tell me, Mr. Briggs, what is it that you're ultimately striving for? A while ago, I answered with a faint smile. Someone asked me a similar question. It was on Titan, when I was applying to the Planetary Assault Academy. I told the colonel leading the selection board that I wanted to witness our victory with my own eyes, and to lead the landing on the Roy homeworld. Since then, things have changed. I've grown older, and my ambitions have grown with me. I no longer want to merely win this war, Mr. President. I want to ensure that the Earth Federation emerges from it strong enough to defeat Roy and to prevail in the far greater conflicts that may lie ahead. That caught Tomlinson off guard. He stared at me in surprise before asking, "You believe something worse than the Roy invasion is still ahead?" "I'm certain of it, Mr. President. I can't give you an exact timeline, but after our victory, our expansion won't stop. We'll push deeper into unexplored space. And we've already met one alien civilization, armed to the teeth, I might add. And we, at that moment, were woefully unprepared. We weren't ready for an enemy like that, yet somehow they were ready for us. Doesn't that strike you as strange? Our first contact with Roy was supposedly a surprise to both sides. So why did they react as if they'd expected it? You speak of our victory as if it's already in the past. We will make it a reality, Mr. President. Otherwise, there's nothing else worth discussing. Your confidence is contagious, Mr. Briggs. So you believe Roy had already been at war with someone else before encountering us? I'm almost certain of it, Mr. President. And more than that, I strongly suspect that Roy didn't invade us simply because we happened to be in their way. Either they were being driven out of previously conquered territories, or they live under the constant threat of attack by a far more powerful enemy. I don't have concrete proof of this theory, but it's something we cannot afford to ignore. We must be prepared for anything. The president received me at his country residence. A beautiful, spacious park with the architectural lines of the presidential palace woven seamlessly into the landscape left a favorable impression. Given the bright, sunny weather, our meeting took place in an open-air pavilion. It was hard to believe this place had once been buried under kilometers of ice. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Briggs," smiled the Supreme Commander of the Earth Federation Armed Forces as he extended his hand. "And mine, Mr. President," I replied, shaking the head of state's hand, accepting his deliberate omission of my military rank. "Your last operation left a deep impression on all of us," President Tomlinson said quietly. "Let's sit down. They'll bring us some tea and my favorite ginger cookies. We have much to discuss, Mr. Briggs." I followed the only marshal in the Earth Federation Army without a word. The cookies were indeed delicious, and the tea made from Highland herbs turned out to be unexpectedly pleasant. I sipped my tea with enjoyment and listened to the head of state, who wasn't rushing to dive into serious matters. He had been sleeping little and working hard lately. It showed. So I kept the conversation light, letting Tomlinson unwind before we got down to business. "Mr. Briggs," he finally shifted the tone. "Over the past year, you've done more for the Earth Federation than anyone else. You're an officer who doesn't fear risk and finds a way out of situations that seem hopeless. And while you're the owner of a private company, both I and everyone around me clearly see that profit isn't your true goal. It matters only insofar as it serves your larger purpose. So let me ask you directly, what is it you're striving for, Mr. Briggs?" A while back, I replied with a faint smile. I was asked a similar question. It was on Titan, during my application to the Planetary Assault Academy. I told the colonel leading the admission board that I wanted to see our victory with my own eyes and to lead the assault on the Royan homeworld. Since then, a few things have changed. I've gotten older, and my ambitions have grown. I no longer just want to win this war, Mr. President. I want to make the Earth Federation strong enough not only to crush the Roya, but to prevail in even more terrifying conflicts yet to come. Tomlinson hadn't expected that. He looked at me with surprise and asked, "You believe something worse than the Royan invasion lies ahead?" "I'm certain of it, Mr. President. I can't give you a timeline, but after the war, our expansion will continue. We'll push further into the unknown. We've already encountered one alien species, heavily armed, mind you, and we were woefully unprepared. But they weren't. They were ready. Doesn't that strike you as strange? Our meeting was as much a surprise to them as it was to us. And yet, they were ready. You speak of our victory as if it's already happened. We'll make it happen, Mr. President. Otherwise, there's no point in discussing anything else. Your confidence is contagious, Mr. Briggs. So you think the Roya were at war with someone else before us? I'm nearly certain of it, Mr. President. And I seriously suspect the Roya didn't attack us simply because we stood in their path. They may be fleeing an even stronger adversary. Or perhaps they live under constant threat from one. I have no solid proof, but we can't afford to dismiss the possibility. We must be prepared for anything. The president grew silent, his gaze drifting to the rolling green hills around us. The exhaustion and tension of the past months were etched deep into his face. You've never seen a world at peace, have you, Mr. Briggs? He asked, abruptly shifting the subject. You were born into this war, raised in it. You don't know life can be something else entirely. But I remember. I hate war, Mr. Briggs. I hate it, do you understand? And now you're telling me that. Defeating the Roya may only be the beginning of a far greater war. Perhaps I did understand Tomlinson. He had no idea how right he was about me not knowing anything other than war. I didn't know how people lived without battles and death. But Tomlinson did. And from the look in his eyes, he missed that time deeply. That meant he had something to miss. For the first time in my life, I too felt a strong desire to see a world without war. Mr. President, I said quietly, the chance to live in peace is worth the sacrifices we're making now. I may not have known peace, but I remember an old rule. If you want peace, prepare for war. And I intend to be prepared. Tomlinson studied the landscape for a few moments before looking me in the eye. What do you need, Mr. Briggs, to bring us closer to victory? Of all the things he could have said, I hadn't expected something so open-ended. But I knew better than to let an opportunity slip in a conversation with the president. Very well, Supreme Commander. You asked. I want the post of Minister of Military Industry and an unlimited budget. The president blinked. A new look came over him. You're not even 25 yet, Mr. Briggs. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of power and responsibility? I think if you hadn't already decided that I was, Mr. President, you wouldn't have asked me the question. You're a serious and determined man, Mr. Briggs, Tomlinson said thoughtfully. And I see that behind your confidence lies a record of real achievement. The Briggs Arms Company has proven itself under government contracts. But a ministerial position is a political one, and you haven't yet gained enough weight in that arena. Still, I believe you understand that. I won't make you a minister. But I do have another role in mind, one that will serve your goals just as well, perhaps even better. General Barrington, he continued, has once again been appointed by me as the head of the Federation Armed Forces Logistics Command, just as he was at the start of the war. That leaves his current post vacant. This will be the first time in history an officer with the rank of captain is appointed to such a position. Tomlinson gave a brief, amused smile. Don't look so surprised, Mr. Briggs. For your leadership during the defense of the Barnard system, Admiral Nelson recommended you for a commendation and a promotion. He could only nominate you for first lieutenant, given his authority, but Marshal Tomlinson has a bit more leeway. Congratulations, Captain Briggs. My decree appointing you as head of the Defense Ministry's Commission on Advanced Weapons and Technology will be ready within 24 hours. At the service of the Earth Federation, I replied, rising to my feet. The president stood as well, signaling that our meeting was over. Mr. President, may I make a small request? I'm listening, said the Supreme Commander, a note of curiosity creeping into his voice. I'm a combat officer, sir, and I'd like to remain one. I ask your permission to personally conduct field trials and combat deployments of any new military technology being considered for adoption. Why am I not surprised? Tomlinson chuckled again.